The moment Susan Beckett stepped onto the dusty platform outside the Harlan County Land Office, she already knew the day was going to break her. She just had not expected it to be someone else who put her back together. The sun hung low and merciless over the town of Redemption, Texas, in the summer of 1878, baking the hard-packed earth until it cracked like old leather. Redemption was not much to look at: a main street lined with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, a single doctor's office with a faded painted sign, and a post office that doubled as a telegraph station when the equipment felt cooperative. But to Susan Beckett, Redemption was everything, because 3 miles to the east of its crumbling courthouse sat a parcel of 240 acres that had belonged to her father, Eli Beckett, until the fever took him 7 weeks ago. She had not had time to grieve properly. Grief was a luxury for women who had steady income and solid walls around them. Susan had neither. What she had was a stack of bills her father had signed in his name, a mule named Porter who was getting on in years, and a deed to land that the county was about to auction off the moment the estate failed to satisfy the outstanding debt attached to it. She had ridden into Redemption before sunrise, wearing her best dress, a pale blue cotton thing with pearl buttons her mother had sewn before she passed, and her father's wide-brimmed hat, which sat a size too large on her head and kept sliding forward over her dark eyebrows. She was 24 years old, tall and lean the way people who worked hard got lean, with dark eyes that had the quality of deep creek water, still on the surface, running swift underneath. The land office was a narrow building wedged between the assay office and a hardware store that smelled permanently of turpentine. By the time Susan arrived, there was already a small crowd gathered on the boardwalk outside, shuffling in the heat and fanning themselves with hats. She recognized a few faces: Hector Marsh from the valley with his 2 grown sons, Clement Dover who ran the feed supply, and a cluster of men she did not know, wearing the kind of clean, unworn clothes that said they had come from somewhere with more money than dust. She pressed toward the land office door and found it locked. The auction was to be conducted outside. The county clerk had told her in his letter, given the size of the expected gathering. She turned and scanned the crowd, counting the serious bidders by their posture: men who stood with their thumbs in their belts and their eyes sharp, already calculating. Her own plan was modest and desperate in equal measure. She had $32 saved in a tin beneath the floorboard of her father's house. Her house, she reminded herself, even if it might not be for long. She had spoken to Mr. Deaver at the First Territorial Bank about a loan, and he had looked at her from across his tidy desk, with the particular patience men reserve for conversations they have already decided the outcome of, and told her that the bank did not extend credit to unmarried women without a male cosigner. She had no brothers. Her one uncle lived somewhere in Missouri, and she had not spoken to him in 11 years. $32 then. The debt attached to the land was $94. She did not know what the bidding would reach, but she knew it would be more than 32. She had come anyway, because her father had died on that land, and his father before him, and because the creek that cut through the eastern quarter was the place where Susan had learned to swim, and the place where she had buried her mother's favorite shawl when they lowered her into the ground, and she was not ready to hand any of that to strangers in clean clothes. The county clerk, a man named Hobb with a mustache he appeared to be growing as compensation for something, climbed onto a wooden crate at the edge of the boardwalk, and called the gathering to order with the flat authority of someone who had done this too many times. "We're here today for the public auction of parcel number 47, Harlan County, Texas," Hobb announced, shuffling his papers. 240 acres, deeded to the estate of one Elias Beckett, deceased. The estate carries a debt of $94 to the county tax office, and an additional outstanding note of $41 held by Clement Dover's supply house. The opening bid is $140. $140. Susan had heard those numbers in the letter, had repeated them to herself in the dark on the nights she could not sleep. but hearing them spoken aloud in the morning heat made her stomach drop clean through the earth. She gripped her small purse, which held the $32 and a receipt for Porter, and stood as straight as she could. That was when she saw him. He was standing at the far edge of the gathered crowd, slightly apart from the rest, as though he had chosen that distance deliberately. He was a tall man, well over 6 feet, with the broad, composed stillness of someone who had been in enough tight situations to have stopped being ruffled by them. He wore a dark coat despite the heat, the kind of long trail coat that was cut well enough to suggest it had not come cheap, over a plain gray shirt and dark trousers. His hat was black and pulled low, and under its shadow his face was angular and weathered, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut with intention. He was perhaps 30, perhaps 32, it was hard to tell with men who spent their lives outdoors, because the sun traded youth for something harder and more deliberate. He was not looking at the county clerk. He was not looking at the other bidders or at the papers Hob was fumbling with. He was looking at Susan. Not with the leering attention she had learned to deflect since she was 16, not with pity, not with calculation. He was looking at her with a still, focused kind of attention that felt almost like recognition, as though he had seen something in her face that answered a question he had carried a long while. She looked away quickly, heat rising in her neck that had nothing to do with the Texas summer. Hob finished his preamble and called for opening bids. Hector Marsh's eldest son raised his hand almost immediately. 140, 150, said one of the clean-clothed strangers. 160, said Clement Dover, and there was something greedy in the way he said it, smooth and too quick, the voice of a man who had been waiting for this particular morning. Susan closed her eyes briefly. She opened them and raised her hand. $170. Every head in the crowd turned. She heard a murmur go through the gathering like wind through dry grass. Hob looked at her with the slight elevation of one eyebrow that was his version of surprise. "We have 170 from Miss Beckett," he said. 180, said Clement Dover, and he was looking at her now, and the look was not kind. 190, said the stranger in the clean coat. 200, said Hector Marsh's son. Susan said nothing. She had nowhere further to go. She stood very still in the heat and watched the numbers climb above her reach and felt the ground she had grown up on pulling away from her like a river current. She did not hear the new voice at first because it came from that far edge of the crowd, low and cert, not raised at all, just present in the way that thunder is present before a storm, felt more than heard. $300. The crowd went silent. Hob blinked. "I beg your pardon." $300, the man in the dark coat repeated, and this time every person in the crowd heard him plainly because the silence he had created was complete. He had raised his hand once, just once. And he did not look at Hob or at Clement Dover or at Hector Marsh's son or at any of the strangers in their clean clothes. He was looking at Susan Beckett. She stared back at him, her heart hammering in the strange way it does when a person is both frightened and suddenly, inexplicably awake to the world. Hob cleared his throat. $300. Do I have— He looked around. The clean-coated strangers exchanged glances and said nothing. Clement Dover's mouth thinned. Hector Marsh's son looked at his father, who gave a small shake of his head. Going once, going twice. Hob's gavel came down on the crate with a sound like a gunshot. Sold. Susan did not move for a moment. The crowd began to disperse around her, conversations breaking out in low murmurs. The man in the dark coat was moving through the crowd toward the land office door, which Hob was now unlocking, and he passed close enough to her that she caught the faint scent of leather and wood smoke and something clean underneath it, like sage after rain. "Excuse me," she said, because she was not a woman who waited for things to be explained to her. "Excuse me, sir." He stopped. He was close now, and she had to tilt her chin up slightly to meet his eyes, which were a deep, weathered gray, the color of overcast sky over open country. Looked at her with the same attention he had given her before, patient and direct. "You just bought my father's land," she said. "Yes," he said. His voice was quiet and carried a faint roughness to it, the way voices get when they spend more time outdoors than in. I would very much like to know why." He was quiet for a moment, studying her face with that particular focused attention, and then he said, "Because you should have been able to buy it yourself." She stared at him. "That is not a proper answer." "No," he agreed, with something that was not quite a smile but had the shadow of one. "I suppose it is not. My name is Alfred Graves. I was going to speak with Mr. Hobb about the deed. You might want to come along." He said this as though it were perfectly reasonable, as though they were old acquaintances and not complete strangers, and something in the easy certainty of it made Susan Beckett follow him through the land office door before she had fully decided to. Inside, the land office smelled of old paper and lamp oil. Hobbs settled behind his desk and began pulling out the relevant documents with the methodical slowness of a man who considered efficiency a sin. Alfred Graves set his hat on the corner of the desk and pulled a slim leather wallet from his coat pocket. He counted out $300 in crisp bills, more money than Susan had seen in one place in her entire life, and laid it on the desk with the same quietness that seemed to govern everything he did. "The deed," he said to Hobb, "should be written to Miss Beckett." Hobb looked up. "I beg your pardon. The deed. Write it to Susan Beckett. I'm purchasing on her behalf." Hobb looked from Alfred to Susan and back again with the expression of a man whose morning had stopped following the rules he expected it to follow. "That is highly irregular, Mr. Graves. The funds are coming from you. The funds are a gift," Alfred said simply. "The land belongs to her. Write the deed to her." Susan had been standing very still through this exchange. Now she said, in a voice she kept carefully level, "Mr. Graves, I cannot accept a gift of $300 from a stranger." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm not giving you $300. I'm buying you back something that was already yours." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when someone says the exact right thing in the exact right way, and the person who hears it has to take a moment to let it settle. Hobb, who had the look of a man who had spent 20 years documenting ordinary transactions and was now deeply out of his depth, cleared his throat and said, "I'll need a few minutes to prepare the documents." "Take your time," Alfred said, and stepped back to give the clerk his space. Susan moved to stand beside Alfred at the narrow window that looked out onto the main street. Outside, the crowd had dispersed entirely. The street was settling back into its ordinary mid-morning rhythm, a wagon rolling past, a dog moving from shade to shade, someone sweeping a boardwalk. "You came here specifically for this auction," she said quietly. "Yes." "Why? This is not a large parcel. It is not prime land. The water rights on the eastern quarter are good, but it would take years of work to make it profitable. There are better investments." "Probably," he said. She turned to look at him. "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out the window, and then he said, "I heard about the estate situation from a man I know in Laredo who does business with county clerks all over South Texas." He mentioned a parcel being auctioned and a daughter of the deceased who had been refused a bank loan. He paused. "I have ridden a long way in my life and seen that particular situation play out more times than I should have. I had the money, so I came." "You make a habit of this," she said, not quite believing it. "No," he said, and for the first time something shifted in his expression, something that was not calculated or composed but simply honest. "I have never done this before." She held his gaze for a moment. The gray of his eyes in the morning light was quite something. She decided, not cold the way gray can be, but deep, the way mountain stone is deep, full of old weather and patience. "I still cannot simply accept," she began. "Then don't accept it as a gift," he said. "Think of it as a loan. Pay me back when you're able. I'm not going anywhere immediately." "Where are you going eventually?" He looked at her again with that quiet attention. "I have not decided yet," he said. Hobb called them back to the desk. He had prepared the deed with the meticulous slowness of his profession, and Susan's name sat at the top of it in the clerk's careful hand. Susan Marie Beckett. She stared at her own name on that document for a long moment, and then she signed it, and Hobb stamped it, and the land that had held her family for 30 years was hers. She stepped out of the land office into the heat of the morning with the rolled deed in her hand and Alfred Graves walking beside her, and she stopped on the boardwalk and turned to face him. "I do not even know what you do, Mr. Graves," she said, "where you come from, whether you are a good man or a dangerous one." "All three of those are fair questions," he said. "Then answer them." He looked at her steadily. "I came up from Laredo, but I was born in Georgia. I worked cattle for 8 years, from the time I was 22, driving them north out of Texas for ranchers who needed it done. 2 years ago, I stopped driving cattle and started working as a land surveyor for an outfit out of San Antonio. As for whether I'm good or dangerous," he tilted his head slightly, "I would say that is not always a binary choice. That is a very careful answer. I am a careful man." She studied him for a moment, and something about the way he stood there in the late morning heat, unhurried, honest, neither pressing her nor retreating, made her decision for her before she quite knew she was making it. "I have a pot of coffee and a side of salt pork at the house," she said. "It is a poor thank you for what you did today, but it is all I have at present. If you would like to follow me out, you can see the land for yourself and we can talk about whatever arrangement is reasonable." Something warmed in those gray eyes. "I would like that," he said. She was already walking toward where Porter waited at the hitching rail, the mule lifting his shaggy head in recognition. She heard Alfred's boots on the boardwalk behind her, and then the sound of a horse being untied, a big, dark bay mare that stood quietly and watched her with one liquid eye. "What is her name?" Susan asked, nodding at the horse. "Theodora," Alfred said. Susan looked at the horse, and then at the man, and despite everything, the grief of the past 7 weeks, the fear of the morning, the bewildering turn the last hour had taken, she felt something loosen in her chest, some tight wound thing that had been holding itself together by will alone. "That is a very serious name for a horse," she said. "She is a very serious horse," Alfred said, with the same shadow of a smile he had offered before, and this time it was a little more present, a little more like the real thing. They rode out of Redemption side by side in the mid-morning heat, following the road east toward the creek and the land and everything that had held her name in it for 30 years. The Beckett homestead sat on a gentle rise above the eastern fork of Cutter Creek, surrounded by live oak and cedar. The house was modest, 2 rooms, a good stone chimney, a covered porch that ran the full width of the front. But it had been built with care. The logs fitted tight and the roof sound, and the kitchen garden at the side was still producing in spite of the weeks Susan had spent in shock and grief rather than proper tending. Alfred Graves stepped down from Theodora and stood looking at the place for a long moment, taking it in the way a surveyor takes inland, measuring it with his eyes, reading the slope of the ground and the lay of the creek and the placement of the trees. "It is a good piece of ground," he said finally, and he said it with the conviction of someone who knew what good ground meant. "My grandfather chose it," Susan said, tying Porter to the fence post. "He came out from Tennessee in 1841 with nothing but his tools and my grandmother and the intention to stay. He built the first house with cedar logs. My father added the stone chimney and the porch." "And you?" Alfred said, following her up the porch steps. She pushed open the door. "I put in the kitchen garden, and I repaired the well cover when it rotted through last spring, and I painted the window frames." She paused. "My father said I should wait and let a husband do that sort of thing. I told him I did not intend to sit beside a rotting well cover on the chance that a husband might eventually materialize." Alfred said nothing, but she heard him breathe something that might have been a laugh behind her. The inside of the house was clean and plainly kept. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, with 2 chairs drawn up beside it and a braided rug on the floor that Susan's mother had made from old curtain fabric. A shelf along one wall held her father's books, a Bible, a farmer's almanac going back to 1862, a battered copy of a surveying manual, and a tin plate and a tin cup sat on the table, which was set for one. She built up the fire in the kitchen stove and set the coffee to boil and sliced the salt pork into a pan, and she was aware the entire time of Alfred Graves standing near the door in a way that was careful not to take up too much space, which she noticed and appreciated. "Sit down," she said. "You rode a long way this morning." He sat in one of the chairs at the table with a quiet ease and set his hat on his knee. Without the hat's shadow, his face was more open, more readable. He had a scar along his left jaw, fine and old, the kind that comes from a clean cut rather than a rough one. His hands, she noticed, were capable hands broad across the palm, the skin weathered and scarred in the small ways that hands get scarred when they spend years working. "How long have you been alone here?" he asked. 7 weeks, she said, without looking up from the pan. "My father fell sick in May. The fever took him in 10 days. He was a strong man. He never expected it to go that fast." She paused. "Neither did I. I'm sorry," Alfred said, and he said it the way people say it when they mean it rather than when they are filling silence. "He was a good man," she said. "He worked this land every day for 30 years, and he was good to my mother and good to me, and he made one mistake, which was signing notes he could not pay when the rains failed 2 years running." She poured the coffee into 2 tin cups and brought them to the table and sat across from him. He would have paid them eventually. He was the kind of man who always found a way. He just did not have the time. Alfred wrapped his hands around the tin cup and looked at her. "I kept thinking," she said, "that if I could just hold on to the land I could make it right. I have been here my whole life. I know every acre of it. I know where the soil holds water and where it runs dry, and I know the timber on the north quarter would support a small logging operation, and I know the creek grass on the east side is good enough to run a small cattle herd." She looked down at the cup. "But knowing things and having the money to do them are different problems." "They are," Alfred agreed. "So I have to ask you again, Mr. Graves. Not to be ungrateful, because I am grateful, more than I know how to say, but you spent $300 this morning on a woman you had never met, and I need to understand why." He was quiet for a moment, turning the tin cup in his hands. Then he said, "I have been surveying land for 2 years across 4 counties in South Texas. I have watched parcels get stripped from families, mostly women, mostly widows, by debt and by men who understand perfectly that the system is built to make that easy. I have written the surveys that quantify those parcels, and I have handed them to the men who then go to the auction and take them for less than they are worth." He paused. "I have had that sit badly with me for a long time." "Then why did you keep doing the work?" "Because I needed to eat," he said simply, "and because I told myself it was not my place to interfere." He looked at her directly. "Last week I decided that was a convenient story I had been telling myself." She looked at him for a long time. The stove ticked and the coffee cooled between them, and outside a meadowlark called once from somewhere in the live oaks. "That is the most honest answer I have ever received from a man I just met," she said. "I would rather be honest than impressive," he said. "In my experience," Susan said, "those are not usually the same thing." "No," he agreed. "Usually they are not." The salt pork was ready. She served it with cornbread she had made that morning, and they ate at the small table in the plain kitchen, and Susan found, to her own surprise, that the silence between them was not awkward but comfortable. The easy kind of silence that settles between people who do not need to perform for each other. After they had eaten, she took him out to see the land, because she wanted him to see what he had helped her keep. They walked the east quarter first, along the creek, which ran clear and quick over a bed of pale limestone. The live oaks leaned over it on both sides, their roots gripping the bank, and the grass grew thick and dark green where the water reached. "This is the best part," she said. "This is where I want to run cattle eventually. Not a large operation. I have no ambitions toward empire, but enough to be self-sustaining. The slope here is good for drainage," Alfred said, looking at the lay of the land with his professional eye, "and the water flow is consistent, year-round, even in the dry years. My grandfather chose this land for the creek first." He nodded slowly, picking up a handful of soil and working it in his fingers. "This is good," he said, "rich. It would take work to clear the brush on the north slope, but it would be worth it. I know, she said. He looked at her. You know this land the way a person knows something they love. She looked at him, surprised by the directness of it. Yes, she said. I suppose I do. They walked the north quarter next, where the cedar and oak grew thick on the slope, and she showed him where her grandfather had built his first small cabin, the ruins of it now just a stone foundation disappearing under grass. Then the south end, where the ground opened up into a wide meadow that caught the afternoon light and turned it golden. My father was going to build a barn here, she said. He had the plans drawn. He spent 3 winters on those plans. Alfred looked at the meadow with its good light and flat ground and the natural windbreak of trees to the north. He had good instincts, he said. He did, she said softly. They turned back toward the house, walking slowly through the long afternoon shadows of the live oaks, and Alfred said, I have a proposal if you are willing to hear it. She looked at him sideways. I am listening. I am between jobs. The survey work in San Antonio is finished, and my next commission is not until September, 2 months out. I could stay here, I would sleep in the barn or make a camp by the creek. I'm not asking for anything you do not choose to offer, and in those 2 months I could help you get this land working. Clear the north slope, repair the fencing, start the barn. She stopped walking. You are offering to spend 2 months doing hard physical labor on another person's property. I am offering to spend 2 months doing something useful, he said, instead of riding around South Texas waiting for September. And the $300. We will call it wages against future profit, he said, with the shadow of a smile. When the cattle operation is running and turning money, you can settle the account. She stood in the afternoon light among the live oaks, looking at Alfred Graves, and thought about her father and what he would have said. He would have been suspicious. He would have asked hard questions and listened to the answers, and then made up his own mind from the evidence, which was exactly what she was doing. She thought about what she had seen so far. A man who had ridden from Laredo to spend $300 helping a woman he had never met, who had done it without fanfare or expectation, who ate salt pork and cornbread at a plain table without complaint, who read the land with the attention of someone who genuinely loved it. All right, she said, but there are conditions. Name them. You will eat your meals with me at the house. I will not have you camping by the creek like a drifter when there is food enough for 2. You will be honest with me at all times. If something is not working or you need to leave, you will say so directly. And she paused. You will tell me your real reason for being here eventually, not the reason about the system being unfair, which I believe is true. The other reason, the one you have not said yet. He was very still for a moment, looking at her in the long afternoon light, and then he said, That is fair. Good, she said, and turned toward the house. There is a storeroom off the kitchen that is dry and has a good floor. It is better than the barn. You don't have to. I know I do not have to, she said. I am choosing to. He followed her back to the house, and that was how Alfred Graves came to stay. The first 2 weeks were work, plain and hard and satisfying. Alfred rose before dawn and was already moving before Susan came out to start the stove, and by breakfast he had typically assessed what needed doing for the day with the methodical precision of a man trained to read landscapes. They made a list on the back of an old almanac page. The north fence line needed reposting. 3 sections of it rotted through. The well cover Susan had repaired was sound, but the crank mechanism was worn. The clearing of the north slope brush was a 2-person job that would take at least a week. The barn, her father's barn, needed its foundation marked and its timber sourced. They worked together without the awkwardness she had half expected. He was not the kind of man who thought a woman needed to be kept away from real work, which she discovered the first morning when she picked up the post-hole digger without comment, and he simply picked up his own, and they dug side by side without discussion. He was not the kind of man who needed to fill silence with talk, which she valued. And he was not the kind of man who looked at her as though she were something to be managed, which she valued most of all. On the evenings when the work was done and the light was going gold over the meadow, they sat on the porch with coffee and sometimes talked, and sometimes simply sat. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn terrain by walking it, not all at once, but each step revealing something new. He had grown up in a small town in Georgia, the second son of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died when he was 11. He had left Georgia at 22. There was not enough room, he said simply. And she understood this to mean not physical room but the particular compression that happens to people in places where everyone already knows what they are supposed to be. He had spent 8 years on cattle drives that took him from South Texas to Kansas and back, learning the land of the interior with the attention of someone who intended to understand it. He had read widely more than most men she had met, and had opinions about books and about politics, and about the way the land was being divided and sold across the West that were careful and reasoned, and not always comfortable. He told her about the injustice of it without making it into a speech, the way the homestead system worked in theory and the way it worked in practice, the way banks and land offices and legal structures all tilted in the same direction, the way women and families without capital were systematically stripped of property that should have been protected. He said it quietly, and with the weariness of someone who had watched it long enough to understand the mechanism completely. "My father never thought it would happen to him," Susan said one evening, watching the sky turn from orange to deep rose over the Cedar Ridge. "He was a man who worked hard and paid his debts on time for 30 years. Thought that was enough." "It should have been," Alfred said. "It should have been," she agreed. A comfortable silence settled between them. A whippoorwill started up somewhere in the oaks, its call rhythmic and insistent. "Tell me about the survey work," she said. He looked at her. "What about it? Do you enjoy it?" He thought about this. "I enjoy the part that is about the land itself, reading it, mapping it, understanding how it lies and how water moves through it. That part I find genuinely beautiful." He paused. "The part where the survey becomes a legal instrument that gets used to separate people from their homes, that part I have been enjoying less and less." "What will you do after September?" He looked out at the meadow in the fading light. "I have been thinking about that." And he turned to look at her, and in the low evening light his gray eyes were warm and serious. "I am still thinking," he said. She let that sit. She was learning that Alfred Graves never said more than he had worked out, and that when he had worked something out he would say it plainly. She found she could be patient with that, which surprised her, because patience had never come naturally to her with anyone else. On the 14th day, Clement Dover rode out to the homestead. Susan saw the horse coming up the track from the main road, and knew from the set of the rider's shoulders exactly who it was before she could see his face. She was in the kitchen garden, pulling weeds from the bean rows, and she stood up and waited. Alfred was on the north slope, visible at a distance as a dark figure moving among the cedar trunks, clearing brush with a long-handled billhook. He either had not seen or was waiting to see what developed. Dover pulled up at the gate with the particular air of a man who had practiced what he was going to say on the ride over. He was not a large man, but he had the well-fed solidity of someone who had prospered, and his mustache was trimmed and his shirt was pressed, and he wore the expression of someone delivering news that was unpleasant for the recipient but perfectly fine for him. "Miss Beckett," he said. "Mr. Dover," she said, not moving from the garden. "I heard you held onto the property," he said. "You were there," she said. "You know what happened." "I do," he said. He looked at the house, at the cleared ground near the barn site, at the repaired fence line. "Looks like you have had help." "I have had help," she agreed. "The man from the auction, Graves." "Yes." Dover worked the reins in his hands. "That is an unusual arrangement, Miss Beckett. A single woman and a man she does not know, out here alone." Susan felt the very familiar heat of this kind of conversation, the way men used propriety as a tool when they could not find another one that fit. She kept her voice level. "Mr. Dover, you are welcome to whatever opinion you like about my arrangements. What you are not welcome to is a say in them." Dover's expression shifted slightly, a tightening around the eyes. "I am just concerned for your welfare," he said. "I thank you for the concern," she said evenly. Was there something you needed? He looked at her for a moment. I had wanted to speak to you about purchasing the timber rights on the North Quarter, he said. I know you are in a difficult financial situation and I thought, I am not selling the timber rights, she said. You have not heard the offer. Mr. Dover, I grew up on this land. I know what the timber on that slope is worth. Whatever you offer will be less than it is worth because that is how offers like this work. She looked at him steadily. I am not selling. He sat on his horse for a moment longer and then he said, I helped your father when he was short, you know. That note he signed, he needed that money. I know, she said, and I will pay it in time. But it does not entitle you to the timber. Dover gathered his reins. He looked toward the north slope again, and his expression, just for a moment, showed something colder than concern. Then he settled back into his careful pleasantness. You let me know if your thinking changes, he said, and turned his horse and rode back down the track. Susan stood in the garden and breathed slowly, watching him go. Alfred came down from the slope an hour later, his coat off and his shirt damp from the work, carrying the billhook over one shoulder. He stopped beside the garden and looked at her. Dover came, she said. I know. I saw him from up top. He set the billhook against the fence post. What did he want? The timber rights on the North Quarter. She brushed the dirt from her hands. I told him no. Alfred nodded. He will come back, he said. I expect so. Are you all right? She looked up at him. There was something in the question, the directness of it, the absence of any performance around it that she was not entirely prepared for. Yes, she said. I am all right. I am angry, but I am used to that. Being angry at the right things is useful, Alfred said. It is certainly better than the alternative, she agreed. He picked up the billhook and looked toward the barn site. I need to ride into Redemption tomorrow for lumber and hardware, he said. I thought I would speak to the sawmill about the timber for the barn frame. I will come with you, she said. I expected you would, he said, with that shadow of a smile. They rode into Redemption the next morning, Alfred on Theodora and Susan on Porter, who was slow but steady and had opinions about everything, expressed in the flattening of his ears. The town was quiet in the early morning, the main street soft with dust, the buildings throwing long shadows west. At the general store, Susan picked up supplies: flour, coffee, cornmeal, salt, and Alfred fell into conversation with the store's owner, a man named Birch who had lived in Redemption for 20 years and knew its history the way people know things they have watched from close up and cared about. Birch told them without being asked about Clement Dover's business history in the county, about the supply house that had extended credit generously in good years and foreclosed on debts efficiently in bad ones, about the 3 other properties Dover had acquired through similar means in the past decade, about the way the county tax office and Dover seemed to operate with a comfortable mutual understanding. Alfred listened to this with his usual quiet attention and asked a few specific questions, and when they left the store he was thoughtful in a way that had edge in it. He has done this before, Susan said, as they walked toward the sawmill. Multiple times, Alfred said. And with the same pattern, he extends credit, he waits for a hard year, and then he lets the debt compound and the auction do his work. Is that illegal? Not precisely. It is the law working exactly as some people designed it to. He paused. But there may be things that can be done. At the sawmill, Alfred spoke with the operator about timber prices and barn construction, and Susan listened and contributed. And gradually she noticed that people in the town treated Alfred with a kind of easy respect that suggested he had been through here before, or that he simply carried himself in a way that made people listen. He did not demand attention. He simply made you want to give it. On the way home, riding side by side on the wide road east, Susan said, You have been here before, in Redemption, I mean. Once, he said, 2 years ago doing survey work in this county, and you remembered it. I remember most places I have been, he said, but I remembered this one more than most. She glanced at him. Why? He was quiet for a moment, looking ahead at the road. I heard about your father's property then. The water rights on the East Quarter came up in conversation with the county surveyor. He said it was one of the better parcels in the county, and he mentioned the family who had held it for 30 years. He paused. I think I remembered it because it sounded like something worth holding on to. She watched the road and said nothing, but something warm moved through her that she chose not to examine too closely just yet. August came in hot and brilliant, the sky a deep, merciless blue from edge to edge, the air so dry it made the wood of the fence posts creak. They worked through it steadily, the barn foundation marked and dug, the frame timber sourced and hauled, the first posts going up in the wide meadow where Susan's father had drawn his winter plans. The barn rose slowly, the way good things build with patience and attention, each piece fitting to the next with the logic of structures designed to last. Alfred worked with the competence of someone who had built things before, not with a carpenter's precision, but with the practical intelligence of a man who had learned what held and what did not on the open range. Susan worked beside him, handing up timber when he was on the frame, holding boards while he nailed them, learning the structure from the inside out. On a Saturday evening in the third week of August, with the barn half-framed and the afternoon gone gold over the meadow, Susan was in the kitchen making supper when she heard Alfred come up onto the porch and stop, and then the sound of his boots crossing the board slowly, and then he knocked at the open door, which he had never done before. She turned. He was standing in the doorway, cleaned up from the day's work, his hair damp and his coat back on despite the heat, holding his hat in his hands, and she knew immediately from his expression, from the particular quality of his stillness, which was different tonight, less composed and more deliberate, that he had worked something out. "Come in," she said. He came in and stood near the table and did not sit down, which was also different. "You said," he started and stopped. "Sit down, Alfred," she said gently. He sat. She set a cup of coffee in front of him and sat across from him and waited. "You said at the beginning," he said, looking at the cup, "that I had to tell you the real reason eventually, the other reason, the one I had not said." "I remember," she said. He looked up at her. "The man in Laredo who told me about the auction. He described the situation, and then he mentioned that the daughter of the deceased was a young woman living alone, and that she had tried for a bank loan and been refused, and that she was likely to lose the land." He paused. "And I sat with that information for 3 days before I decided to come. I told myself it was about the injustice of the situation. I told myself it was about the land system. Those things are true. But they are not the only reason I came." Susan said nothing. "I came," he said quietly, "because I have been riding around South Texas for 2 years doing work I am increasingly less proud of, and I have been looking not consciously, not with a plan, for a reason to stop, for something that felt like it deserved to be stayed in." He held her gaze steadily. "When I walked into that auction this morning and saw you standing there, holding your head up in the heat with your father's hat on, looking at that county clerk like you would walk through fire before you let him sell your grandfather's land out from under you, I thought, that is a woman worth knowing." The kitchen was very quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, the meadow was going purple in the late evening light. "Alfred," she said, "I am not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I am simply being honest the way you asked me to be." "I know," she said, "and I am going to be honest back." She looked at him across the table. "I noticed you before you ever raised your hand. At the auction. I looked away because I was embarrassed to be caught looking." She folded her hands on the table. "I have been grateful to you every day for the past 3 weeks. I have also been something else, which is interested. In you, as a person, considerably more interested than is strictly appropriate for a woman in my situation." He was very still. "I am not a romantic fool," she said. "I am a practical woman who has learned to take things at the pace they actually go, and I think," she paused, "I think I would like to know you better, and I think I would like you to stay, not just until September." He looked at her with those gray eyes that were nothing like cold, and then he said, very quietly, "I would like that too." She stood up and went to check the supper on the stove, because she was a woman who kept things moving even when her heart was doing something complicated in her chest, and he sat at the table and said nothing. But when she glanced over her shoulder, she found him watching her with an expression she had never seen on a man before, not possession or performance, but something simpler and more sincere, something that looked very much like wonder. September came without Alfred leaving. He sent a letter to the survey company in San Antonio explaining that his circumstances had changed, and received back a politely worded reply that expressed regret and wished him well, and that was the end of that. He said nothing about this to Susan directly, but she saw the letter and understood, and she did not make him talk about it, because some decisions are large enough that they need space around them. The barn was finished in the 3rd week of September. On the day they hung the last board and stood back to look at it, solid and square in the meadow, smelling of fresh timber and pine tar, Susan stood beside Alfred in the late afternoon light and felt something shift in her chest that was too big and too complete to be anything other than what it was. "My father would have loved this," she said. "What was he like?" Alfred asked. "When he was working," she smiled, which was a thing her face had been doing considerably more often in the past weeks. "He sang while he worked. Hymns mostly. He did not have a good voice, but he did not let that stop him. He said God did not grade on quality." She paused. "And he would bring me out here when I was small and show me where the light was good and where the soil was rich and explain why the land was the way it was. Not just what it was, but why. I think that is the most important thing he ever gave me." Alfred looked at the barn and then at the creek glittering in the low light and then at her and said, "Will you walk with me?" She looked at him. "Where?" "By the creek," he said. "There is something I want to say, and I think I want to say it there." She walked with him down through the live oaks to the east quarter, where the creek ran clear and quick over the limestone, and the evening air was cooler and smell of water and green things. They stood on the bank in the last of the light, and he turned to face her. "I want to ask you something important," he said, "and I want to ask it here because this is the land you love, and I want the asking to be in the place that matters most to you." She looked at him steadily, her heart doing the thing it always did in his presence, that deep, quick movement that was half joy and half the kind of honest fear that comes from caring about something real. "Susan," he said, "I came here as a stranger, and you let me stay. And in these weeks, I have come to understand that I would very much like to stay a great deal longer than that. I am not a man of many words, and you already know the kind of man I am, my flaws and my history and the things I have done that I regret. I am not trying to impress you. I am simply asking, as plainly as I know how, would you consider becoming my wife?" The creek moved past them, and a heron lifted from the far bank and sailed downstream in the evening silence, and Susan Beckett looked at Alfred Graves beside the water on her grandfather's land and thought about her father, who had worked this soil for 30 years, and her mother, who had woven beauty into ordinary cotton, and herself, who had stood in the dust of a land auction and refused to let any of it go. "Yes," she said. "I would." He reached out and took her hand carefully, the way you take something you value, and she let him, and they stood by the creek in the September evening as the light went from gold to rose to the deep blue of coming dark. They were married on the 15th of October, 1878, in Redemption's small Methodist church, with Birch from the general store as witness on Alfred's side and old Mrs. Harrington, who had taught Susan her letters and never forgotten her, as witness on Susan's. The Reverend Caldwell, who was a man of considerable common sense as well as considerable faith, performed the ceremony with warmth and without unnecessary length, and when Alfred said, "I do," he said it looking directly at Susan with the same focused attention he had fixed on her at the land auction, unwavering and complete. Susan wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Harrington had helped her alter from one of her mother's good pieces, and she wore her hair down, which she almost never did, and she held Alfred's hands at the altar and felt, for the first time since her father's death, like the future was something solid rather than something she was fighting to reach. Clement Dover heard about the marriage within the week. He sent no congratulations. 2 weeks after the wedding, Alfred rode into Redemption and spent an afternoon at the county record's office with a man he had telegraphed to San Antonio, a lawyer named Whitfield who had experience with land law and debt disputes. They spent 3 hours going through records, and what they found was not surprising but was sufficient. Dover's practice of letting interest compound on notes without proper notification, the way he structured his debts against widows and families without clear legal counsel, the relationship between his supply house and a specific assessor at the county tax office, who consistently undervalued properties before auction. None of it was straightforwardly criminal, but taken together, it was enough to bring a formal complaint to the county judge, who happened to be a man named Earlham, who was not in Dover's pocket and who had, in fact, been looking for grounds to examine the situation for some time. The complaint was filed in November. The investigation was quiet and careful and took several months. Dover, for his part, seemed to understand that something had shifted in the county's atmosphere and became abruptly less eager about his acquisition plans. Alfred told Susan about it matter-of-factly, without drama. He told her about the records and the lawyer and the judge, and he told her it was not certain to resolve in a satisfying way. These things rarely were, but that the mechanism had been made visible and documented, and that visibility was the first step. "You did this for me," she said. "I did it because it needed doing," he said. "You are why I noticed it needed doing." She looked at him across the supper table and said, "Alfred Graves, you are going to be very difficult to live with." He raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because you keep being exactly the right kind of man, and it sets a very high standard." He looked at her for a moment and then laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the first time she had heard it quite like that, and she thought she could get used to that sound for the rest of her life. They spent the winter working the land and working at being married, which is its own kind of labor, the good kind, the learning of another person's rhythms and moods, the negotiation of small preferences, the discovery of what you do not know about someone until you are sharing walls and daily bread with them. She learned that Alfred woke early but was slow to talk until he had his first coffee, which she respected. She learned that he had a dry, quiet humor that came out sideways when he was comfortable, and that he read before sleeping, whatever he could find, almanacs and newspapers and the few actual books on her father's shelf, and that he had strong opinions about the construction of fences, and genuinely enjoyed the process of solving practical problems. He learned that she was most herself in the early morning, that she sang while she worked, not hymns, which was her father's style, but folk songs she had learned from her mother, in a voice that was clear and unself-conscious, and that she had a temper that was slow to ignite but hot when it did, and that she was the most competent person he had ever watched at the business of keeping land alive. He learned that she cried exactly once, in January, standing at her father's grave at the edge of the north slope where they had buried him under a cedar tree. Alfred found her there and said nothing, only stood beside her, and after a while she reached out and took his hand without looking at him, and they stood there together in the cold winter light until she was ready to go back to the house. Spring came, and with it the first cattle, 4 young heifers and a bull that Alfred sourced from a rancher south of town who was downsizing his operation, bought at a fair price with money Alfred had saved over his years of survey work. They were not many, but they were a beginning, and Susan stood at the new fence of the east quarter in the March morning and watched them move through the creek grass with a feeling that was so full it was almost painful. "4," she said. "For this spring," Alfred said beside her. 12 next year if we are careful, 24 the year after." "You have done the arithmetic," she said. "I have done the arithmetic," he said. She looked at him, this man who had raised his hand once at an auction and never once looked away from her, who had come into her life with $300 and a big gray-eyed attention and stayed because she had asked him to, and because he had already decided this was where he wanted to be. And she thought about the word lucky, which seemed too small, and the word grateful, which was part of it but not all. "I love you," she said. It was the first time she had said it in exactly those words, plainly and without anything around it. He turned to look at her, and his expression was everything she had learned to read in him, the quiet depth, the honesty, the particular warmth he reserved for her, and he said, "I love you, Susan. I have for a long time." How long, she asked, because she wanted to know. He thought about it with the characteristic seriousness he brought to questions worth answering. "Since the auction," he said. Not love exactly then, it was too soon for that, but the beginning of it, the certainty that I wanted to know. "You raised your hand once," she said. $300 just like that." "It seemed like the right investment," he said. She laughed and leaned into him, and he put his arm around her in the cool spring morning, and the four heifers moved through the green creek grass below them, and the barn her father had planned stood solid in the meadow to the south, and the house with its good stone chimney and its painted window frames sat on the rise above the creek where it had sat for 30 years. In the summer of 1879, the county judge concluded his investigation into Clement Dover's business practices. The outcome was a formal censure of the assessor at the county tax office, a requirement that Dover restructure his outstanding notes under terms that actually complied with the statute on debt and interest, and a new set of county guidelines for land auctions that required proper notification periods and independent property valuation. It was not everything. It was not justice in the complete and satisfying sense that justice is supposed to be. But three families who had been on the edge of losing their properties to Dover's particular method kept them, and the practice became considerably more difficult to run going forward. Alfred told Susan about the ruling at supper, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "It is not enough." "No," he agreed, "but it is more than there was before." "I will take more than there was before," she said, "for now." He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was love and respect together, which is the best combination of the two. "For now," he agreed. September of 1879 brought news that made the world expand in a new direction. Susan was expecting. She told Alfred on a clear Tuesday morning while he was repairing a section of fence near the barn, because she was not a woman who dressed news up in ceremony when the news itself was already sufficient. He put down the fence wire and looked at her, and then crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and held her carefully at first, and then firmly, the way you hold something you are afraid of losing and grateful beyond expression to have. "Are you well?" he asked, against her hair. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am a great many things right now, but well is one of them." He pulled back to look at her, and the expression on his face was one she stored away carefully to hold onto uncalculated joy, the pure kind, the kind that happens before a person has time to edit it. "When?" he asked. "The doctor thinks March," she said. "Or April." He nodded, still looking at her with that expression. "March or April," he said, as though the words themselves were remarkable. "Are you going to be all right?" she asked, because she had noticed the slight color in his face and the set of his jaw. "I am more than all right," he said, and his voice had something rough in it that she understood was not distress but the opposite. "I am Susan. I have not had a family since I was 11 years old." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, against the old scar. "You have one now," she said. He turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to her palm, and she felt it through her whole body, that quiet, deliberate tenderness that was so essentially him. The winter was the warmest kind of cold, if that makes sense, the cold outside that makes the inside feel warmer by contrast, the long evenings by the stone fireplace with Alfred reading and Susan sewing, and the cattle settled in the barn through the worst nights. They talked in those evenings about everything and nothing, about what the coming year might look like for the herd, about the books Alfred was reading, about Susan's memories of growing up on the land in all its seasons. She told him about the winter her father had taught her to track deer through the snow on the north slope, and the summer she had fallen in the creek, trying to catch a catfish barehanded and come up laughing. She told him about her mother, who had been a quiet, determined woman with a gift for making beauty from ordinary materials, who had died of a respiratory illness when Susan was 17 and left a hole in the house that nothing had ever properly filled. Alfred told her about the cattle drives, not the romance of them, which was mostly invented, but the reality, which was 12 hours a day on horseback, and whether that tried to kill you and the strange, strong brotherhood of men who spend months together crossing empty country. He told her about learning to read the land from a Comanche scout named Follows the River, who had worked briefly for one of the outfits Alfred rode with, and who had a way of understanding terrain that Alfred had never seen in any textbook. He told her about the things he had learned from that man about patience and attention, and the way the land itself will tell you what it needs if you stop and listen. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," Susan said. "He was," Alfred said. "I hope he is well. I lost track of him when the drive disbanded in Kansas." "What happened to the outfits when the cattle business changed?" "They adapted or they ended," he said simply. "Most ended. The drives were already in decline by the late 70s. The railroads made them unnecessary." He was quiet for a moment. "A lot of the men I rode with did not do well with the change. They were made for a particular kind of life that was ending, and they did not know how to be anything else." "But you did," she said. He looked at her. "I had choices they did not," he said. "I had education enough to shift into survey work, and I was willing to change what I was doing." He paused. "I think the willingness to change is the thing that saves people, not talent or luck, just the willingness." She watched the fire and thought about her own changes, from the daughter of a farmer to a woman alone with a deed and a debt, and then to this, the warm interior of a house that was hers, with a man beside her who chose to be here, and new life coming with the spring. "I think you are right," she said. "The baby came in April, not March, as the doctor had first calculated, but April, which was perhaps fitting since April is the month of everything opening." It was a long labor, through the night and into the early morning, with Mrs. Harrington there as midwife and Alfred downstairs in the main room, which was where Susan had firmly sent him, because she did not need an audience for this particular work, but she needed to know he was close. She could hear him down there, the steady movement of his boots on the floor, the sound of the fire being stoked, the occasional low voice as he spoke to Mrs. Harrington's granddaughter who had come to help carry water. When the baby announced himself at 4:30 in the morning with the vigorous displeasure of someone who finds the air cold and the world insufficiently spacious, Susan lay back against the pillow with the particular exhaustion of someone who has done something enormous and heard Mrs. Harrington say, "A boy, Susan. A fine, healthy boy." Alfred was allowed in 5 minutes later, which was as long as it took for Mrs. Harrington to make things presentable. He came to the side of the bed and looked at Susan first, not the baby, Susan, with an expression that was all relief and love. And then he looked at the small, red-faced creature wrapped in the blanket on her chest. "Hello," he said softly to the baby. The baby, who did not yet have opinions about greetings, regarded him with the unfocused intensity of the newly arrived. "He looks serious," Alfred said. "He looks like he is already planning something," Susan said, which was true. Alfred sat carefully on the edge of the bed and touched the baby's cheek with one careful finger, and the baby's tiny hand opened and closed like a sea creature finding water. "Eli," Susan said. "I want to call him Eli." "After my father." Alfred looked at her, his throat moving. "Eli Graves," he said quietly. "Yes." She watched Alfred look at their son and thought about the morning at the land auction, which felt very far away now and also very close. The way important moments are both of those things simultaneously. She thought about the moment Alfred had raised his hand once and never looked away from her, and she thought about everything that had come from that single gesture. The land kept, the barn built, the cattle in the East Quarter grass, this warm April room, this child. "Alfred," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. He understood she did not mean only this moment. He reached out and took her hand gently and held it. "Thank you," he said back, and he meant something just as large. Eli Graves was a serious, curious baby who grew into a serious, curious boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's measured attention to the world. He was walking by the time the spring of 1881 arrived, toddling through the kitchen garden with the single-minded determination of someone going somewhere important. And by the summer, he had opinions about the cattle that he expressed with pointed sounds and by standing at the fence pointing at them. The herd had grown by then. 12 head, as Alfred had calculated, careful and healthy, running in the east quarter where the creek grass was thick and the fencing sound. Alfred had hired a hand in the spring, a young man from town named Pete Coulter, 20 years old, quiet and willing and good with animals, to help with the daily management, which freed Alfred for the other work. The North Slope timber, which he had begun selling selectively and sustainably to the Redemption sawmill, and a secondary contract he had taken up with the county doing honest survey work under terms he had negotiated himself, which put him in control of how the results were used. Susan ran the household and the kitchen garden and the books, which she had taken over from Alfred with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had been doing mental arithmetic since childhood. She kept the accounts in a journal her mother had given her, entering each expense and each income in her careful hand, and at the end of each month she showed Alfred the balance, which was moving steadily in the direction she wanted it to go. The debt to Alfred, which they had long since stopped calling a debt and started calling the beginning of everything, was notionally settled in the summer of 1881, when the herd turned its first real profit. Susan entered it in the journal as account balanced and showed it to Alfred at supper, and he looked at it and looked at her with a warmth that made the words entirely unnecessary. "What shall we do with the profit?" he asked. "More cattle," she said immediately, "and the water channeling on the south meadow. If we can get consistent irrigation there, we can hay that field and reduce the feed cost over winter." He looked at her with the expression he wore when she said something that delighted him. "I love how your mind works," he said. "I love that you say things like that," she said, "as though a woman thinking practically is remarkable." "It is not remarkable," he said. "It is exactly what I expected from you. I love it because it is you." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand briefly and then went back to the journal, because she was a woman who expressed affection in motion, and he was a man who had learned to read her fluently. In the autumn of 1881, with Eli 2 years old and steady on his feet and into everything, Susan discovered she was expecting again. This one came easier, a swift, almost businesslike labor in November, and arrived as a girl. "Eleanor," Susan said, looking at the small pink face. "After your mother." Alfred, who had told her once about his mother only in passing, a schoolteacher named Eleanor who had died when he was 11, went very still for a moment, and then nodded, and his expression was full of something he did not put into words but that she understood completely. Alfred Graves was nothing like serious. She was loud and cheerful from the beginning, a round, fair child with her father's gray eyes and her mother's quick, decisive movements, who grabbed at everything within reach and laughed at things that weren't funny, and made the house feel fuller than its walls could reasonably contain. She and Eli circled each other with the complex politics of young siblings, Eli regarding her with the cautious interest of a surveyor encountering new terrain, Eleanor regarding Eli with the confidence of someone who has decided she runs things. Alfred watched them one Saturday morning from the kitchen door, where he had come in from outside to find Eli crouched on the kitchen floor explaining something in detail to Eleanor, who sat across from him with her feet out and her expression suggesting she was already planning her counterargument. "They are completely different," Alfred said to Susan, who was at the stove. "They are completely themselves," Susan said, without turning around. "Which is better?" "Yes," he said. "It is." He poured his coffee and stood in the kitchen doorway a moment longer, watching his children on the floor and his wife at the stove, and thought about the morning at the land auction with a clarity that still, 4 years later, had the quality of something vivid and important. He had raised his hand once. $300 on a stranger's land, for a stranger's daughter who had stood in the heat with her father's hat on her head, and looked at the county clerk like she would walk through fire before she gave anything up. He had not been wrong. The years that followed were the kind of years that build a life, not dramatic on their face, not filled with the kind of events that make good stories at saloons, but dense with the particular meaning that comes from being exactly where you are supposed to be and doing work that matters. The herd grew to 30 head by 1883. The South Meadow irrigation worked exactly as Susan had calculated, and the winter feed cost dropped by a third. Pete Coulter married the daughter of the man who ran the Redemption Post Office and came to Alfred one spring morning to say he hoped to stay on as a permanent hand rather than a seasonal one, which Alfred agreed to without hesitation because Pete had proved himself steady and honest and genuinely good at what he did. Alfred took on 2 more survey commissions in 1883, but on his own terms, independent contracts with a clause he had worked out with Whitfield, the lawyer that required the survey results to be disclosed to all affected parties, including families currently occupying the land in question. It was a small thing in the scale of the larger injustice, but it was something, and it had a demonstrable effect in several cases where families were able to make informed decisions about their land rather than being surprised by assessments they had not known were coming. Clement Dover had quietly contracted his operations after the county ruling. He still ran the supply house and probably still extended credit in ways that were predatory, but the particular auction acquisition scheme had been made visible enough that he could not run it openly anymore. Susan was not satisfied with this. She had told Alfred more than once that satisfied was not a word she associated with partial remedies, but she acknowledged that it was better than it had been, and she continued to advocate for the families she knew through the Methodist Church's women's group, helping them understand their legal standing when questions arose. Mrs. Harrington, who was 73 and had the vitality of someone who had decided that age was someone else's problem, told Susan at a church gathering in 1883 that she was the most useful woman in the county, which Susan received with a laugh and a shake of her head, and which Alfred, standing nearby, received with a quiet pride that he did not express aloud but that she saw in his face when she glanced at him. Eli at 4 was a reader. He had his grandfather's almanac and his father's surveying manual and Susan's small collection of books memorized in the approximate way that 4-year-olds memorize things, completely but with creative interpretation. And he sat with Alfred in the evenings and demanded to know the meanings of words with a persistence that Alfred matched question for question, with the patience that was native to his character. One evening in the spring of 1884, with Eli 5 and Eleanor 2, the 4 of them were on the porch in the last of the evening light. The creek was audible from the porch on quiet evenings, a low, continuous sound under the other sounds of the land. Eli was sitting on the porch steps with Alfred's old surveying notebook, which Alfred had given him to draw in. Eleanor was asleep against Susan's shoulder, heavy and warm with the total relaxation of small children in sleep. "He is going to be a good man," Susan said quietly, watching Eli trace something careful in the notebook. Alfred looked at his son. "He already is," he said. She looked at Alfred. "Are you happy?" He turned to her, and the look he gave her was direct and unhurried and entirely without performance, the look of a man who is where he wants to be and has no ambiguity about it. "Yes," he said, "completely." She leaned her head against his shoulder, careful not to wake Eleanor, and they sat in the May evening with the creek sounding below, and the cattle settled in the east quarter and the barn standing in the meadow and the house behind them full of the accumulated evidence of their life together. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the North Slope timber. If we manage it on a longer cycle replant behind the harvesting, it becomes sustainable for decades rather than running out in 10 years. He was quiet for a moment. "We would need to source the seedlings. I talked to Birch last week. He thinks he can arrange supply through the nursery in San Antonio." Alfred looked at her with that expression delight at the working of her mind, at the way she was always 3 steps ahead of the obvious problem, solving it before it arrived. "You already have a plan," he said. "I always have a plan," she said. "You do," he agreed, and she could hear the smile in his voice. Eli looked up from the notebook. "What is a seedling?" he asked. "A young tree," Alfred said, "the beginning of something." Eli considered this with his father's seriousness. "Like me," he said. Alfred laughed, that real laugh, the unguarded one, the one that Susan had decided years ago was one of the finest sounds she knew. "Exactly like you," he said. The summer of 1884 was the best summer the Beckett Graves land had seen in years. Good rain in June. That was not the flooding, disastrous kind, but the steady, seeping kind that filled the water table. And then warm, dry weeks through July and August that let the grass grow tall and thick. The herd was healthy. The timber operation on the North Slope was running on the new sustainable cycle Susan had designed, and the first round of seedlings were in the ground on the harvested section. Pete Coulter and his wife had a baby girl that summer, their first, and Alfred rode into town with a bottle of whiskey and congratulations, and came home slightly cheerful in a way that Susan found endearing. She stood at the kitchen door watching him come up the path from the barn, slightly unhurried in his walk, and said, "How is Pete?" "Pete is the proudest man in the county," Alfred said, coming up the porch steps. He had a look on his face that she knew, thoughtful and slightly far away, the look he got when he was turning something over. "What are you thinking?" she said. He stopped on the porch beside her and looked out over the land in the evening light. "I am thinking," he said, "that I came here with $300 and no particular plan, and I look at all of this," he gestured, "a slow arc that took in the barn and the creek and the North Slope and the cattle in the East Quarter and the house behind them. And I cannot believe how much has happened." "Neither can I," she said. "Are you glad?" he asked. He asked it directly, which was his way, always not fishing for reassurance but genuinely wanting to know. She looked at him for a long moment. At the man he was, the weathered steadiness of him, the honesty that had not softened in 6 years but had deepened, the way he was with their children, with the land, with her. The man who had raised his hand once at a county auction and spent $300 on the daughter of a dead farmer and never once suggested she owe him anything for it. "Alfred," she said, "you are the best decision I have ever made." He reached out and touched her face with one hand, gently, the way he had touched everything he valued since she had known him, with attention and care, and the particular reverence that comes from knowing how quickly things can be lost. "You made your own decision," he said. "You chose to stay. You chose to fight for the land. You chose me." He paused. "I am just glad you had enough left to choose with after everything that had already cost you." She put her hand over his. "You made it easier to choose," she said. He kissed her there on the porch in the evening light, and she kissed him back. And inside the house Eli could be heard explaining something to a leaner with great authority, and a leaner could be heard disagreeing with great volume. And the creek ran below, and the land lay all around them, and the day settled into the warm dark of a Texas summer night. By 1886, the Beckett Graves operation, which was how people in Redemption had come to refer to it, because Susan had kept her family name in the title of the land, and Alfred had never suggested she shouldn't, was one of the more stable small cattle operations in Harlan County. Not the largest, not the most profitable by sheer numbers, but managed with the kind of careful intelligence that meant it did not fail in the bad years, only grew more slowly, and thrived in the good ones. Alfred took on a part-time teaching role at the Redemption School that fall, because the schoolteacher had left for a position in Austin, and the school needed someone to bridge the gap while a replacement was found. He taught mathematics and basic surveying and geography, with the methodical patience of a man who had inherited a teacher's instinct from his father. And he was, by all accounts, considerably better at it than he expected to be. Susan came to watch one afternoon, standing at the back of the small schoolroom while Alfred drew a topographical map on the chalkboard, and 20 children ranging from 6 to 14 watched with varying degrees of attention. She watched him explain how water moves through landscape and why the shape of the land matters, and she thought about the man she had followed into the land office on the morning of the auction, And then about the man standing at the chalkboard, and she thought, "You are more than I knew you would be, and I already knew you would be much." He saw her at the back of the room and did not break his explanation, but something in his posture shifted in the way it always did when she was nearby, a slight openness, a particular awareness. After the children were dismissed, he came to where she was standing and said, inspecting the operation, she said. "I approve." "High praise," he said. "You were good with them," she said. "The ones who were not paying attention, you found ways to bring them back without embarrassing them. That takes skill." He looked at her. "I learned it from you," he said. "Watching you with Eli." She stared at him. "I did not know you had noticed that." "I notice everything you do," he said simply, and she felt it the same way she had felt the first time he said it, like something warm settling through her, deep and certain. The replacement teacher arrived in January of 1887, and Alfred stepped back from the school with the same uncomplicated ease he brought to everything that was complete. He had enjoyed it, he said. He might look for a way to do more of it eventually, in some form. Eli was 8 by then, attending the same school and learning from the new teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Forsyth, who quickly discovered that Eli Graves had read everything she assigned before she assigned it and was quietly waiting for the next level. Susan spoke with Miss Forsyth about supplementary materials, which Miss Forsyth provided with the enthusiasm of a teacher who recognizes a genuinely hungry mind. And Eli spent his evenings working through problems 3 grades above his own, while Eleanor, age 6, sat beside him drawing horses in the margins of her own notebook with systematic intensity. Eleanor had decided she was going to run the cattle operation when she grew up. She said this to Alfred at breakfast one October morning with the clarity of someone announcing a fact rather than a preference. Alfred, over his coffee, said, "What makes you want to do that?" "Because I am good with them," Eleanor said. "The cattle listen to me." This was true. Eleanor had a way with the animals that was different from both her parents, not her mother's practical assessment of them or her father's careful observation, but a kind of direct, personal authority that the cattle seemed to recognize and respect. Pete Coulter had remarked on it more than once. "Then you will do that," Alfred said. Eleanor looked at him with her gray eyes, satisfied. "I know," she said. Susan, bringing the biscuits to the table, caught Alfred's eye over Eleanor's head, and they shared a look that was entirely their own pride and amusement and love, all 3 together. In the spring of 1888, Susan's uncle wrote from Missouri. It was the first contact in 15 years. A letter that arrived somewhat crumpled, having been forwarded through 2 post offices, in which the uncle explained that he had heard from a distant cousin that Eli Sr. had passed, and that Susan had stayed on the land, and that he was sorry for his long absence, which he attributed to circumstances that he acknowledged were not entirely sufficient justification. Susan read the letter at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time afterward. "Will you write back?" Alfred asked. "Yes," she said, "but not today." She wrote back in June, a careful, honest letter that acknowledged the distance and did not pretend it had not existed, but that left a door open rather than closing one, because she was a woman who believed that family, even imperfect family, was worth the effort of honesty. The uncle, his name was George Beckett, and he was her father's younger brother, a farmer himself, widowed, in his late 50s, wrote back with something that was halfway between an apology and an explanation, and succeeded moderately at both. They began a correspondence that was slow and careful and grew, over time, into something warmer and more useful. He visited in the autumn of 1889, a lean, weathered man with her father's jaw and a quieter version of her father's manner, who stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the house and the land with an expression of someone doing complicated arithmetic between memory and the present. "Your father would be proud," he said to Susan. "I know," she said. He shook hands with Alfred with the careful assessment of a man who had missed the courtship and the wedding and the years between, and was now meeting his niece's husband without the context that should have come before. Alfred met the assessment steadily and without performance, and George Beckett, who was a practical man, made up his mind within the first hour that his niece had not made a mistake. He stayed 2 weeks, worked alongside Alfred and Pete Coulter on the fence line repairs, entertained Eli and Alina with stories about their grandfather as a young man, and left on a gray October morning with the air of someone who intended to return. He did return, the following spring and the spring after that, and eventually the visits became a fixture of the year, something the children looked forward to, and something Susan found healing in ways she had not expected, this late and imperfect closing of a gap her father had never seen closed. The county investigation of 1879 had had its slow, rippling effects. By 1889, the Harlan County land auction rules were among the more regulated in the region, not perfect, not sufficient against all the ways that land can be taken from people who should have kept it, but better than they had been. Alfred had continued his independent survey work on his own terms, and in 1887 he had begun writing a series of letters to the Texas Land Office on behalf of several families he had surveyed for, documenting inconsistencies in the assessment process that he believed constituted procedural violations. 2 of those cases resulted in assessments being reversed. It was not the sweeping change that the problem required, but it was real, and the families who kept their land because of it were real families. Susan told him once, when he was discouraged by the pace of it, that the most useful kind of justice is the kind that happens one family at a time, because that is the level at which land is actually held or lost. He looked at her and said, "How do you always know the right thing to say?" "I do not always know," she said. "But when I do, it is usually because I have been thinking about it for a long time." "You think about things for a long time and then say them like they just occurred to you," he said. "That is the correct approach," she said firmly, and he laughed. By 1890, the Beckett Graves land was everything Susan had told Alfred it could be. That first day when she walked him through the quarters and showed him the creek and the timber and the meadow. The herd was 42 head, healthy and managed. The timber operation was self-sustaining, as she had planned. The barn her father had drawn in winter plans stood solid and weathered now in the south meadow. The house had a new room added on the back. Alfred and Pete Coulter had built it in the spring of 1885, when it became clear that 2 growing children and 2 adults in 2 rooms was reaching its logical limit, and the kitchen garden was 3 times its original size and supplied more than just the house. They were not wealthy. They were not large by the standards of the Texas cattle operations that had grown enormous in the intervening decades. But they were stable, and they were rooted, and the land was theirs in every sense, legally, emotionally, practically. And in the deep way that land becomes yours when you have worked it through every season and learned its moods, and held onto it through the years that tried to take it. On a late September afternoon in 1890, Susan sat on the porch in the angle of the afternoon light with Alina beside her, 12 now, serious in her own way about the cattle and the land, with Alfred's gray eyes and a directness that was entirely her own, going over the herd accounts together. Eli, 13, was somewhere on the north slope with Alfred and Pete, doing the autumn assessment of the timber stand. Alina was asking sharp questions about the cost per head calculation, and Susan was answering them directly, without simplification, because Alina had made it clear from the time she was small that she found simplification insulting. "Why do we account for the feed cost separately from the water management cost?" Alina asked. "Because they respond to different conditions," Susan said. "Feed cost goes up in dry years when the grass fails. Water management cost goes up in wet years when channeling needs more maintenance. If you lump them together, you cannot tell which variable is causing the change." Alina nodded, entering something in the notebook with her careful hand. "You are very good at this," Susan said. "I know," Alina said without arrogance, just with the same factual confidence she applied to everything, Then after a pause, she looked up from the notebook. "Mother, were you frightened when you almost lost the land?" Susan looked at her daughter. "Yes," she said, "enormously. But you went to the auction anyway." "Yes. Why?" Susan thought about it, not for show, but genuinely, the way she always considered questions worth answering. "Because being frightened does not tell you whether something is worth doing," she said finally. "It only tells you that you care about the outcome, and if you care about something, you go." Alina looked at her with Alfred's eyes for a moment, and then nodded and went back to the notebook. Alfred and Eli came down from the north slope an hour later, both of them carrying the particular look of people who have spent the afternoon in good outdoor work, slightly weathered by the air, satisfied in the body. Eli was as tall as his father now, in the places teenage boys get tall before they fill in the rest, and he had Susan's dark eyes and Alfred's composure, which was an interesting combination. Alfred stopped at the porch steps and looked at Susan and Alina at the table with the accounts between them. "How does it look?" he asked. "Good," Susan said. "Better than last autumn. Alina found an error in September's feed cost entry." Alfred looked at Alina. "Good catch," he said. Alina accepted this with a nod. Eli dropped down on the porch steps and stretched his long legs out. "The eastern section of the timber stand is ready for another harvest cycle in 2 years," he said to Susan, who had asked him to observe and report. "Father says the replanting from 1884 is coming in strong." "Good," Susan said. "I will add it to the forward planning calendar." Alfred sat beside her on the bench, and she felt his familiar warmth at her side, and the late afternoon settled around them all, the sound of the creek below, the cattle moving in the east quarter, Pete Coulter singing something to himself by the barn, the smell of the land in the dry September air. 12 years since the auction. 12 years since Alfred Graves had raised his hand once in the morning heat of Redemption's Main Street and never once looked away from her. She looked at him now, in the September afternoon, and found him already looking back at her, which was still the thing about him, after all this time, that moved her most. The quality of his attention, the way it had never faltered or changed its direction. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the beginning, as though she were the most interesting and important thing in whatever landscape they happened to be standing in. "What?" he said softly, because she was looking at him with an expression he probably recognized. "Nothing," she said. "Everything." He put his arm around her there on the bench, easy and natural, and she leaned into him and looked at the land, their land, held and worked and known, and at their children on the porch in the late afternoon sun, serious Eli with his father's composure and Alina with her father's eyes and her own formidable certainty. The land auction morning had been the beginning of something. $300 and one raised hand and a gaze that had never looked away, and it had led to this, to all of this, wide and rooted and warm, to a family and a piece of ground and a life that meant what she had always needed it to mean. There were still injustices in the world. There were still women losing land they should have kept, still systems that tilted against ordinary people, still a long way to go before the promise of the country matched its practice. She had not stopped knowing that, and she had not stopped working against it in the ways available to her, and neither had Alfred. But right now, in the September light, with her daughter's pencil moving across accounts and her son's legs stretched out on the porch steps, and her husband's arm around her, and the creek sounding below and 30 years of family sitting in the soil beneath them, Susan Beckett Graves allowed herself to be exactly where she was. It was enough, it was more than enough, it was everything. The creek ran on, as it always had, clear over the old limestone in the last of the autumn afternoon, carrying the sound of water through the land that her grandfather had chosen and her father had worked, and she had refused to give away, carrying it forward into whatever came next. And there was a great deal that would come next, she knew, because there always was when you held onto the things that mattered and built from the ground up with honest hands and an open heart. The sun went down over the cedar ridge, painting the sky in wide strokes of red and gold, and the evening came on soft and cool, and Alfred looked at her and she looked at him, and between them sat the whole of what they had made, not perfect, not without its costs, but real and good and lasting. "Come inside," she said, when the light had gone low enough that Alina had stopped writing. They went inside, all four of them, into the warm kitchen with the stone fireplace and the braided rug and the shelf of books and the tin cups on the table, and the evening settled around them like something earned, like something permanent, like home.